Welcome, champions, to another update to the game and specific champions due to the next upcoming season. Season 4, Legends of Mithril Hall. This time we are visiting the Companions of the Hall with some heavy reworks, minor tweaks, and, well, no tweaks. Before we dive into this season's changes to champions, there is a new mechanic implemented into the base game. Critical strikes. Originally tied to Catti-brie, both the player and enemies now have a base chance of 2.5% for 100% more damage on a critical hit. Some champions will gain feats and abilities to interact with this new critical system, but as you may have guessed, that will mostly be covered by the Companions of the Hall of Season 4. Another base change is to how the Companions of the Hall function together. Each slotted champion to the Companions of the Hall now also add a count of Mithril Hall stacks, which will affect those champions in ways I will explain shortly. But it no longer contributes to a global gold find bonus like it used to. You'll see a theme of lower damage buffing numbers that will ramp up to some pretty decent numbers as you land critical hits and stuns on enemies. In this video, I will be covering the changes and where they might move on my tier lists based on those changes. If you want a more detailed reference for how they used to work before these changes, don't hesitate to check out my older videos. We're going to go El Clasico, working up seat by seat. So that means today we're starting with Regis in seat 2. He has some reworking, but as a whole largely works the same. His specializations remain untouched completely, so you still need to choose whether you want him to buff those ahead of or behind him, and if he's going to further increase the damage of those who are melee, ranged, or magical. And the base values of his Ruby Encouragement damage buff also remain untouched. He does, however, have a way to heavily increase its potency with Ruby Amplification, which increases its effect each time he critically strikes, stacking 15 times and applying multiplicatively, the stacks resetting when you change areas. To aid in applying this, his critical is increased naturally to a 20% chance, and they also halved his attack cooldown, so he attacks faster, allowing him to do this rather frequently. And if you can manage a couple of stacks, this brings Ruby Encouragement up to a potentially girthy buff. Also, to aid in his ability to critically hit, his Ruby Invigoration has been reworked so that when your formation suffers a critical hit from an enemy, he will store a charge, up to 5, of an increase to his chance to critically hit. And when he does crit, he expends a charge. This is all important for his rework to his healing as well. Instead of healing when the formation comes under attack, and then never again from that point on, you know, the useless heal of useless healing, he now instead heals the formation when he critically strikes, with Ruby Healing. The potency of the heal is increased for each Mithril Hall stack the formation has. But don't get too excited, because at full efficiency, we're still looking at a very average number of healing, i.e. barely useful. That being said, it's better than it used to be. He now is the exclusive holder of the Bounty of the Hall, where he increases your gold find based on how many mithril stacks you have in your formation. Because of this, he now also has the gold find tag. Overall, he's better than he was, and while he loses his stacks when you change areas, he has the tools to gather them back fairly quickly. Will you be able to get him to a full stack in every area? Probably not, unless you prepare plenty of slows and stuns, but still high enough to matter. I'm moving him up to the A tier. And now we have Artemis in seat 3, which a lot of people were probably biting their nails wondering what they were going to do with him in a full-blown seasonal rework. But here we are. Nothing. None of his numbers, formation abilities, or specializations are changing at all. He will, however, have some new feats with the season when it starts next week, and have chests and item levels aplenty to earn. So for those of you who want to start buffing him up, this is your golden opportunity. I seem to remember someone saying something about if he was ever able to be looked at, he really only needed help in the feat department. But if there ever was something to make him at least a little more interesting, it's in his feats. Oh, but more importantly, don't let Codename Entertainment gaslight you. Look at it. What is this? This isn't his skin. Where is this base Artemis with a beard, huh? He doesn't have a beard like that anywhere with that outfit, and it's not his seasonal skin reward either. Now we have Pwent in seat 5. His bleed has become its own passive ability that now deals bud damage every second for 20 seconds when applied with his primary attack, which is so much better than scaling off his own damage. His bleed also comes with a useful debuff that will cause any bleeding enemy to have an additional flat 20% chance to be critically hit by any champion in your formation. His positional damage buff has been incredibly simplified, now buffing non-adjacent champions with his "Can you smell that?" and no longer affects a champion's attack speed negatively. Just get him away from your DPS because he's a stinky boy. However, you want him adjacent to those who are actively critically striking, as now with Gutbuster recruits, he will increase the effect of "Can you smell that?" multiplicatively up to 50 times for each time an adjacent champion critically strikes, losing all stacks when you change areas. While he is classified as unaffiliated, he does add to the Mithril Hall stacks, as if he was a part of their affiliation, and scales up "Can you smell that?" based on how many stacks there are. His specializations have been changed to fall in line with his rework, the first making it so Gutbuster recruits now triggers off those non-adjacent, so you can position him not adjacent to both your DPS and those who are actively critically striking. The second will increase his damage buff from "Can you smell that?" for every dwarf in the formation, for which he will always count for at least one. And lastly, his bleed will now add a 40% chance to crit from attackers instead of 20%. And don't forget, his ultimate is a handy tool that will gather up all enemies on screen, apply his bleed to all of them, while also stunning them. He's better than he was, and even though I thought he was a bit underrated by the masses, he's easier to use and more serviceable now. I think he moves up to the B+ range. Just remember to have him adjacent to champions that will critically hit frequently, like Regis and Catti-brie. Speaking of Catti-brie, she's up next in Seat 7. She also gains a natural 20% chance to crit, and largely works the same as she did before. With Mark for Death, she marks enemies she attacks, who then take more damage until they are defeated, and increases the damage of herself and all of those in front of her with Push Forward, which gains a stack each time she gets a critical strike, stacking multiplicatively up to 25 times, and resetting when you change areas. While she starts with that flat 20% chance to crit, she does have a gear slot tied to her critical chance, so you can scale this up to be a guaranteed critical strike every single time she attacks. So you can stack up Push Forward very quickly. It doesn't scale quite as hard as the rest of the companion's abilities do now, though when you combine Push Forward with Mark for Death, she still is a potent damage buffer. I believe they were taking Artemis's observance into consideration with Push Forward, so he didn't scale too hard off of it. But she is still excellent for Artemis. Grievous Wounds will enhance Mark for Death by making any marked enemy hit by a critical from any champion be stunned for 5 seconds, and increase the damage bonus of Mark, but can only proc once every 10 seconds. The damage buff stacking up to 10 times multiplicatively. Mithril Hall stacks will increase her Mark for Death damage buff, and she still targets the farthest enemy on screen and deals more damage personally to enemies farther away from the formation. But her specializations have changed, now having 3 choices between Piercing Arrow, which increases her damage but also makes her arrows pierce through any enemies along the path to the furthest enemy she attacks, which can still be good for support as well, scaling up Push Forward quicker with her potential multiple guaranteed crits. The second will increase the base effect of Push Forward and make her only lose half her stacks when changing areas, so she maintains a decent damage bonus from it. And lastly, will additively increase the critical hit chance of all Companions of the Hall by 20%, if you're looking to get some affiliation synergy rolling. And her ultimate still works the same, where she attacks 6 targets and makes those hit have a higher chance of being critically hit, and take more critical damage based on her crit chance and damage for 30 seconds. As far as any change to her tier ranking, I think she inches up just a little higher. And lastly, for the big changes, we have Wulfgar in Seat 10. Let me remind you, he's one of the few I have all the way down in F tier. And there are a few reasons for that, one of the biggest being that one of his main sources of damage buffing was completely reserved for those within his affiliation. Well, his damage buffing has been reworked, and he can now work with anyone. Praise be. His Clangeddon's Will increase the damage of all champions in the formation anytime anyone stuns an enemy, stacking up to 50 times multiplicatively, with stacks being lost when you change areas. If you can quickly apply stuns either through the companions or other abilities like Naeli's ultimate, this can stack rather quickly, and ramps up very fast to an excellent buff. This is also increased for every Mithril Hall stack with Hammer of the Hall multiplicatively. He also has a base 20% chance to crit, but all of his critical hits will also stun all of the enemies he hits for 5 seconds with his tight AoE primary attack. So increasing his chance to crit might prove vital. Retaining his temporary hit point generation, he gains temp HP whenever he stuns bosses with Dumathoin's Will, and also keeps Smash and Grab, where he also increases the damage of all champions if he hits an armored enemy and does not remove a chunk of armor. And on top of all of that, he gains some availability in being able to be used in any Icewind Dale adventure regardless of restrictions, which even further pays off with his change of specializations, which are a choice between increasing all champions' chance to critically hit by 10%, increasing the effect of Clangeddon's Will by 100%, and makes it so he only loses half of his stacks when you change areas, or increasing the damage of the Companions of the Hall and pulls a little bit of a Nahara, bringing in his affiliation to any Icewind Dale adventure even if they weren't available due to restrictions. He's a high damage buffing tank with temporary hit point generation, stuns, and unique availability. He's pulling a Cridle and rising in the ranks, ascending to the middle of A tier. There are a few other champions who received minor tweaks, 2 of which directly belong to the Companions of the Hall, but are not included in the Season Pass, likely because they are a core and evergreen champion. First is Bruenor, who gains King of the Hall, which increases his rally for every Mithril Hall stack you have. He will also, like the rest of the Companions, gain feats to increase Mithril stack counts. And of course, Drizzt, who has been reined in as the Companions of the Hall damage dealer. His specializations have changed to either increase his damage based on the number of Companions of the Hall in the formation, or drow. He gains more feats to work with to boost his damage as well. And lastly, we have Jarlaxle, bit of an odd man out, with feats to increase his critical chance and critical damage, but also a Constitution +1 feat to make him available for Vajra. None of these minor changes are enough to affect their placement on my tier list, but I kinda thought about it since Drizzt and Bruenor no longer have any source of gold find. I do like the concept of switching up some of the on-kill or otherwise clunky mechanics to proccing on crits or stuns, as I personally hate on-kill mechanics, but that's personal preference. I also like the potential synergy with the multiple champions. They are a solid affiliation that have had their numbers adjusted to all be relevant and work well together as a ramping up, damage buffing, and crowd control heavy group. And while they clearly work best when used together, they all have the opportunity to stand on their own feet as well. I'm personally not 100% sold on Artemis being here as a seasonal champion, as kind of the whole point of a season is to bring in a champion who needs to be reworked and brought up to the current power threshold. That being said, it is a really good thing for those who want to put some work in on Artemis who haven't been able to yet. So if you've been thinking about giving that top DPS dog a go, there has never been a better time than with this season. Thanks for hanging around today. Crit and stun that like, sub, and bell for me. Leave a comment on what you think of the new and improved Companions of the Hall. And always remember, have a hell of a time out there, champion. But I